What's good, people? Welcome to the Escapism channel. I'm your host, Terrelle. If you're new here, welcome. If you're returning, welcome. If you end up liking this video and you are new here, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. If you're familiar here and you're subscribed already, please hit the like button. That'll help the channel. In today's episode, I'll be speaking about episode 2 of Uzumaki, which is the anime adaptation of Junji Ito's classic story. Just to catch you up, I did do a video last week on the first episode. Check that out if you want to know my extensive thoughts on the episode. But to give you a quick summary, my thoughts on that very first episode of the anime was that it was overall a good episode, a good start to the anime series, but I did have some concerns, and my main concerns were with the pacing and the fact that this anime series is only 4 episodes long. They're less than half an hour long, the episodes themselves, and I just felt that's a lot of story from the manga to cram into 4 episodes. Didn't really know how they were going to do it, and the way that the first episode was paced, I saw some concerns with that. And the second episode came out today. I watched that a few hours ago, and well, my concerns with the pacing have been justified. They seem justified by watching this episode. Now, the second episode here juggles 5 different chapters from the manga at once, which is a lot of work and very tough to pull off. And the manga chapters at play here is Twisted Souls, The Snail, Jack in the Box, The Black Lighthouse, and Medusa. That's the name of the 5 chapters from the Uzumaki manga that are incorporated into this one episode that runs at about 25 minutes long. Now, the snail chapter appears to be a through line that is going to potentially run through the entire show in all 4 episodes, because you did get a little sneak peek at the snail chapter in the first episode, and I did say back then that that is eventually going to lead to something and pay off. You get a majority of that payoff in this episode because they do focus on that chapter, but they do not finish that chapter in this episode. So that leads me to believe it's going to continue into the next episode at the very least. So it's kind of one of the main through lines of this anime series is that snail chapter. The other chapters are kind of all spliced together into this one episode and kind of reach their conclusion pretty much in this one episode. You have the way the episode starts is quite strange because it starts with that snail chapter, like following on from that. And then it cuts into the Twisted Souls chapter. And then it shows brief moments, or actually, no, I believe it actually starts with the Jack in the, it transitions from the snail chapter into the Jack in the Box chapter. And then it shows little seeds of the Twisted Souls chapter. And at first I was thinking, like, this is very sudden. It's jumping between these chapters very suddenly. And then I started to realize what they're doing. I'm like, okay, they're connecting and splicing these chapters together and blending them. And I noticed that even more because my favorite chapter, or one of my favorite chapters in the Uzumaki manga, is the Medusa chapter. Really love that chapter. And I was looking forward to seeing that's probably the element of the manga that I was looking forward to seeing the most in this show. And due to where it is in the manga, I was expecting it potentially in this episode. And when I started to see them showcase elements of the story that are beyond that chapter, I thought, wait, what's going on? Have they just skipped out the Medusa chapter? How could they skip out one of the most iconic chapters in the manga? And then I realized they didn't do that because later on in the episode, you start to see fragments of that chapter. And what they've essentially done is they've incorporated the Medusa chapter into this episode and blended it with the snail chapter so that the characters and the elements of those stories flow within each other, which is different to how it is in the manga. Because in the manga, you have almost 2 separate stories being told in each chapter that don't they cross paths in terms of the main characters of this whole story that you see, but the individual elements of these chapters don't cross paths in the manga, but they did it in this show. And at first I thought, okay, that's an interesting direction to take. That could potentially work, and I could understand the intent behind it is that they're trying to blend these 2 chapters together and make it actually more cohesive as a story for this grander anime story across the 4 episodes. And I thought, okay, fine, fair enough. But I think the issue is they didn't stop at that point. There was a little section of this episode where you saw those 2 elements cross paths. So you saw the 2 stories almost combined into one, but then they didn't stop. So those other 3 chapters I spoke about that this show juggles on top of those 2 that I just mentioned, they get spliced into it as well. And that's where I think a lot of the issues come into play more so, and become more noticeable because then the Jack in the Box chapter gets spliced into this as well. And the downside of this is that all of these chapters suffer due to the pacing and lack of build-up with the respected stories. I've said it in the first episode, and this is why it was such a concern for me and for other people that commented on the video. Pacing is such an important element of Junji Ito's stories. And the build-up sometimes is very slow and suspenseful build-up, and the payoff is very, very shocking. And that happens consistently throughout the manga. With each chapter, you get something's introduced, a new element's introduced with the spiral, or something that's being influenced by the spiral, and then it slowly builds. And it slowly builds, and there might be new characters that get introduced into these different chapters as well. And whatever's going on with them and how it relates to the story, it slowly builds. And then by the end of the chapter, you get the payoff, or sometimes halfway through the chapter, you get multiple payoffs. But the suspense and that slow initial build that establishes things is what helps build to that impact. And the problem that this episode has, and I saw shades of it in the first episode, but it's a much bigger problem here because they're juggling five chapters at once, is that there's no breathing room at all. Um, and it really hampers each individual story. And personally, there's elements to each individual chapter that I think some people wouldn't even really understand why it's so impactful in the manga and why it's so special in the manga, because how it's been translated here is so chopped down. It's like these chapters have been chopped to pieces just so they can fit into one whole within 25 minutes, which I think is very rushed and is doing a disservice to the source material. The Twisted Souls chapter is potentially the chapter that suffers the most here because we spend no more than two very brief scenes with the two new characters introduced in that chapter, and they're integral to what happens in this chapter, but we only see them in one scene right at the beginning of the episode, which is already like halfway through their story in the manga, but as to where they're introduced in this episode. And then we get one other brief scene and then it jumps to the conclusion of their chapter. And because we don't see that particular chapter is about a couple that are struggling with their respected families and the conflict that their relationships creating with their families, and it's making them want to leave the city. And because we don't actually see until the very final scene, we don't actually even see their family, let alone the conflict that's going on within their family and how it's affecting them. So because we don't actually see that, if you're an anime only watcher, you're not going to understand what's going on, the build up, the necessary build up of this chapter to understand why these characters have got to this point and to make the ending more impactful. You're not going to get that. And me, as someone who has read the manga, you can just immediately see why it's much less effective because of what they've chosen to do here. And it's because we only get those two brief scenes with them before it fast tracks to the conclusion of their chapter within the next scene that they're featured in. And like I said, we never get to experience their family. You only hear about it, which robs the story of its impact. And that's kind of a thing that happens across the board with a lot of these chapters that are included in this episode. The Jack in the Box one, again, is a much shorter chapter in the manga, if I remember correctly. But the build up to it is just completely shortened because of how it's spliced together into this episode. So you only get the one brief odd scene with the main character before the main event of that chapter happens, and it just feels like so slapdash because of the way it's implemented and the things that are supposed to feel significant in these chapters and that lead to the impact and the feeling of impact are just completely missing. And what I thought they might have done and what I speculated in that first episode that they might have done, once I realized that they were only doing 4 episodes, which is really short for this show, and this is what I believe they should have done, is just cut some of the chapters from the show altogether. I think it would have been a better job if they just cut some of these chapters out of the show because they're only doing 4 episodes, and that would have been better than rushing through them, haphazardly splicing them together and just robbing them of their impact, and as a whole, kind of robbing the story of its impact. Because now, the first episode I thought was good, and I had some concerns. This second episode now has got me kind of worried for how the next two episodes are going to turn out and the show overall. I think what started off as something quite promising could quickly descend into something quite disappointing by the end of the 4 episode run. And it's all the more shocking. And the next point I'm about to get onto is relates to this as well. But it's all the more shocking that they spent so long making this, 4 years, and for them to kind of get this element of it so wrong when they had so much time to make it is actually quite baffling. And the other element that I think is quite baffling in this episode, and it stood out to me quite, it was quite noticeable to me. I noticed it halfway through the episode, this aspect. And when I went online after I watched the episode, I noticed actually a lot of people were complaining about it, so I'm not the only one. The animation did not seem as impressive this time around. And according to the credits, and this is what I've seen someone post online, so I haven't checked it myself, but according to the credits and what that person posted, this second episode was actually handled by a different animation studio to the first, and I can believe that because there is a noticeable dip in quality of the animation. And there's a few scenes where you really notice it, and one in particular is a scene on the beach, and this is an aspect of the Twisted Souls storyline. There's a scene on the beach which has poorly animated movement. But essentially, what it is the characters are running along a beach, but it looks like the CGI model of the character has been traced, copied, and their bodies are made to animated to move to look like they're running. But instead of them actually running on the surface in the animation, it's like they're running on the spot, and then the animators just moved the character model across the screen. So it looks like they're just gliding across the surface, not actually running across the surface. And it's a really noticeable and really bad animated effect. And when you compare that to how good the animation was in that first episode, like you could watch that first episode and the movement and the way things flowed in that first episode from an animation standpoint, you could see why it took so long for them to make it. But this episode's different. And that leads me into some of the other aspects that disappointed me. The Medusa storyline, like I said, is one of my favorite in this anime. And that involves hair and hair is making spiral shapes. And whenever there was an element of that where I thought the hair should have flowed or should have moved in a particular way to simulate a spiral swirling or anything like that, all the aspects of movement like that with the hair. And these are not unreasonable things to expect because the first episode did this thing quite well, actually. If you looked at how the hair was animated in the first episode on the characters when it blows in the wind, very impressive stuff. So I expected the same here, but in this episode, even when it deals with aspects that are really focused on the hair, like the Medusa sequences, it's all static. There's no movement within that animation. And I found that to be very disappointing and very underwhelming, given the focus on those elements in certain aspects of these chapters in this episode and given how it was presented in the first episode. So I could definitely believe that a different animation studio handled this episode because it actually felt like it. Another scene that is set within a lighthouse. So this is part of the Black Lighthouse storyline. There's an aspect of this chapter where a character is supposed to be burned alive within the lighthouse. Um, but in this episode, we don't actually see him within the flames, nor do we see the aftermath of him getting burned like you do in the manga. And that's one of the most impactful images from this chapter in particular. And it's like they just rushed it and rushed past it to cut corners for whatever reason, whether that's budgetary or due to time constraints, which I find hard to believe because they had 4 years to work on this. But it's like they skipped over showing that particular image. And I don't know if that's because it was a child in the scene, but I highly doubt it. Um, but that was disappointing nonetheless, because that is one of the more shocking and memorable images from that particular chapter. They didn't even bother to show it within the animation of this episode. So there is a number of issues with the animation, and I think that's the other worrying thing. So we've got two pillars of concerning things that have arisen in this second episode. Um, One that I didn't see coming, which is the animation, because I thought the animation was one of the great things about the first episode. So that's a sudden concern, and I'm intrigued to see who's actually at the helm of the animation for the third and fourth episode. Because if it's the same people that did this one, that lowers my faith a lot. Whereas if it's the same team that worked on the first episode, then maybe I'll have a little bit more optimism for the final two episodes. But then the other thing is the issue that I did have concerns over, which is the pacing, which I think is it really reared its head in this episode. Everything is so choppy, everything moves so fast, nothing has time to breathe. Characters get introduced and then disappear like really quick. And if you're reading a chapter in the manga, you understand it because it's like a short story of its own, and it kind of starts and concludes and moves at a good pace. Whereas in this episode, it's all so quick and it's also jumbled together that I can imagine if you don't have knowledge of the manga, you're watching this and you're thinking, why is this character just appeared and then just disappeared literally in the next scene? Like, what was the point of that? So I don't think it flows that well as an episode, like that. And like I said, there's an escalation in the manga. That's what makes it so impactful, and that's what made them so effective and so memorable. Is there's an escalation in the chapters, and this typically happens in all of Junji Ito's stories. It escalates. There's a slow build up and escalation, and that's missing noticeably from this episode because there's no time for these stories to breathe. And that's really the big downside of this episode, which really harms this episode and my perception of the show overall now. So Uzumaki episode 2, in summary, I'd say it juggles five different chapters across its 25-minute runtime. All of those stories lose their impact and suffer as a result of their rush pacing. This should have been, they should have just cut some of these chapters out of the show instead of trying to squeeze them all into one episode, and I think that could have helped it. But now I'm just really concerned about the rest of the show now, in terms of its animation and in terms of its pacing. And it started so promisingly, but now I'm concerned that they might not actually stick the landing. So yeah, episode 2 of Uzumaki was a surprising disappointment. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section if you've seen the episode. If you've read the manga, let me know your thoughts on it and let me know your thoughts on how they've translated the manga. If you're watching just anime only, let me know your thoughts from your perspective of only knowing the anime. Comment below. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you're new here and you enjoyed it, hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. I speak about anime, films, video games on this channel, so you're welcome to subscribe if you enjoy the content. And please hit the like button as well because that'll help me out and help out the channel. I'll speak to you guys in the next episode. Take care.